Hello and welcome back to the channel. This week I will be addressing the biggest lie that Flirfs like to use every time they open their yaps. You are not allowed to go to Antarctica. Obviously, Flirfs are either stupid or illiterate because none of them ever bothered to read the treaty in the first place. So, to make sure they understand, I'm going to read it for them. This might be a long video, but if you've ever wanted to know for sure what the treaty says, you're going to find out in this video. So stick around. If you're like me, you're probably fed up of hearing that old tired lie that we can't go to Antarctica because some killer penguins and some huge imaginary world military force is going to shoot us. Then you've come to the right video. I'm so sick and tired of hearing that, I just had to take inspiration from the recent ranty video on If I Told You Once, I Told You 1,000 Times. That's right. Today, I am going to read the entire Antarctic Treaty, all 14 articles. I will also be including an overview of the Manual of Regulations and Guidelines relevant to tourism and non-governmental activities in the Antarctic Treaty area. So stick around, let's get started. The Antarctic Treaty. Preamble. 12 countries represented by the governments of Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Chile, the French Republic, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, the Union of South Africa, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the United States of America signed the Antarctic Treaty on 1 December 1959 in Washington, recognizing that it is in the interest of all mankind that Antarctica shall continue forever to be used exclusively for peaceful purposes and shall not become the scene or object of international discord, acknowledging the substantial contributions to scientific knowledge resulting from the international cooperation in scientific investigation in Antarctica, convinced that the establishment of a firm foundation for the continuation and development of such cooperation on the basis of freedom of scientific investigation in Antarctica is applied during the International Geophysical Year accords with the interests of science and the progress of all mankind. Convinced also that a treaty ensuring the use of Antarctica for peaceful purposes only and the continuance of international harmony in Antarctica will further the purposes and principles embodied in the Charter of the United Nations, have agreed as follows. Article 1. Peaceful Purposes. 1. Antarctica shall be used for peaceful purposes only. There shall be prohibited inter alia any measure of military nature such as the establishment of a military base or fortification, the carrying out of military maneuvers, as well as the testing of any type of weapon. 2. The present treaty shall not prevent the use of military personnel or equipment for scientific research or for any other peaceful purpose. Article 2. Freedom of scientific investigation. Freedom of scientific investigation in Antarctica and cooperation toward that end as applied during the International Geophysical Year shall continue subject to the provisions of the present treaty. Article 3. International Scientific Cooperation. 1. In order to promote international cooperation in scientific investigation in Antarctica, as provided for in Article 2 of the present treaty, the contracting parties agreed that, to the greatest extent feasible and practicable, 1. Information regarding plans for scientific programs in Antarctica shall be exchanged to permit maximum economy and efficiency of operations. 2. Scientific personnel shall be exchanged in Antarctica between expeditions and stations. 3. Scientific observations and results from Antarctica shall be exchanged and made freely available. Part 2. In implementing this article, every encouragement shall be given to the establishment of cooperative working relations with those specialized agencies of the United Nations and other international organizations having a scientific or technical interest in Antarctica. Article 4. Territorial Sovereignty. Part 1. Nothing contained in the present treaty shall be interpreted as 1. A renunciation by any contracting party of previously asserted rights or claims to the territorial sovereignty in Antarctica. 2. A renunciation or diminution by any contracting party of any basis of claim to territorial sovereignty in Antarctica, which it may have, whether as a result of its activities or those of its nationals in Antarctica or otherwise. 3. Prejudicing the position of any contracting party as regards its recognition or non-recognition of any other state's rights or claim or basis of claim to territorial sovereignty in Antarctica. Part 2. No acts or activities taking place while the present treaty is in force shall constitute a basis for asserting, supporting, or denying a claim to territorial sovereignty in Antarctica or create any rights of sovereignty in Antarctica. No new claim or enlargement of an existing claim to territorial sovereignty in Antarctica shall be asserted while the present treaty is in force. Article 5. Nuclear activity. 1. Any nuclear explosions in Antarctica and the disposal there of that radioactive waste material shall be prohibited. 2. In the event of the conclusion of international agreements concerning the use of nuclear energy, including nuclear explosions, and the disposal of radioactive waste material, to which all of the contracting parties whose representatives are entitled to participate in the meetings provided for under Article 9 are parties. The rules established under such agreements shall apply in Antarctica. Article 6. Geographical coverage. The provisions of the present treaty shall apply to the area south of 60 degrees south latitude, including all ice shelves, but nothing in the present treaty shall prejudice or in any way affect the rights or the exercise of the rights of any state under international law with regard to the high seas within that area. Article 7. Inspections. 1. In order to promote the objectives and ensure the observance of the provisions of the present treaty, each contracting party whose representatives are entitled to participate in the meetings referred to in Article 9 of the treaty shall have the right to designate observers to carry out any inspection provided for by the present article. Observers shall be nationals of the contracting parties which designate them. The names of observers shall be communicated to every other contracting party having the right to designate observers, and like notice shall be given to the termination of their employment. 2. Each observer designated in accordance with the provisions of paragraph 1 of this article shall have complete freedom of access at any time to any or all areas of Antarctica. 3. All areas of Antarctica, including all stations, installations, and equipment within those areas, and all ships and aircraft at points of discharge or embarkation, cargo and personnel in Antarctica, shall be open at all times to inspection by any observers designated in accordance with paragraph 1 of this article. 4. Aerial observation may be carried out at any time over any or all areas of Antarctica by any of the contracting parties having the right to designate observers. 5. Each contracting party shall, at the time when the present treaty enters into force for it, inform the other contracting parties, and thereafter shall give them notice in advance of 1. All expeditions to and within Antarctica on the part of its ships or nationals, and all expeditions to Antarctica organized in or proceeding from its territory. 2. All stations in Antarctica occupied by its nationals, and 3. Any military personnel or equipment intended to be introduced by it to Antarctica, subject to the conditions prescribed in paragraph 2 of Article 1 of the present treaty. Article 8. Jurisdiction. 1. In order to facilitate the exercise of their functions under the present treaty, and without prejudice to the respective positions of the contracting parties related to jurisdiction over all or other persons in Antarctica, observers designated under paragraph 1 of Article 7 and scientific personnel exchanged under subparagraph 1b of Article 3 of the treaty, and members of the staffs accompanying any such persons shall be subject only to the jurisdiction of the contracting party of which they are nationals in respect of all acts or omissions occurring while they are in Antarctica for the purpose of exercising their functions. 2. Without prejudice to the provisions of paragraph 1 of this article, and pending the adoption of measures in pursuance of subparagraph 1e of Article 9, the contracting parties concerned in any case of dispute with regard to the exercise of jurisdiction in Antarctica shall immediately consult together with a view to reaching a mutually acceptable solution. Article 9. Treaty Meetings. 1. Representatives of the contracting parties named in the preamble to the present treaty shall meet at the city of Canberra within 2 months after the date of entry into force of the treaty, and thereafter at suitable intervals and places for the purpose of exchanging information, consulting together on matters of common interest pertaining to Antarctica, and formulating and considering and recommending to their governments measures in furtherance of the principles and objectives of the treaty, including measures regarding 1. Use of Antarctica for peaceful purposes only. 2. Facilitation of scientific research in Antarctica. 3. Facilitation of international scientific cooperation in Antarctica. 4. Facilitation of the exercise of the rights of inspection provided for in Article 7 of the treaty. 5. Questions relating to the exercise of jurisdiction in Antarctica. 6. Preservation and conservation of living resources in Antarctica. Part 2. Each contracting party, which has become a party to the present treaty by accession, under Article 13, shall be entitled to appoint representatives to participate in the meetings referred to in paragraph 1 of the present article, during such times as that contracting party demonstrates its interest in Antarctica by conducting substantial research activity there, such as the establishment of a scientific station or the dispatch of a scientific expedition. Part 3. Reports from the observers referred to in Article 7 of the present treaty shall be transmitted to the representatives of the contracting parties participating in the meetings referred to in paragraph 1 of the present article. Part 4. The measures referred to in paragraph 1 of this article shall become effective when approved by all the contracting parties whose representatives were entitled to participate in the meetings held to consider those measures. Part 5. Any or all of the rights established in the present treaty may be exercised as from the date of entry into force of the treaty, whether or not any measures facilitating the exercise of such rights have been proposed, considered, or approved as provided in this article. Article 10. Activities contrary to treaty. Each of the contracting parties undertakes to exert appropriate efforts consistent with the Charter of the United Nations to the end that no one engages in any activity in Antarctica contrary to the principles or purposes of the present treaty. Article 11. Disputes between parties. 1. If any dispute arises between two or more of the contracting parties concerning the interpretation or application of the present treaty, those contracting parties shall consult among themselves with a view to having a dispute resolved by negotiation, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, judicial settlement, or other peaceful means of their own choice. 2. Any dispute of this character not so resolved shall, with no consent in each case of all parties to the dispute, be referred to the International Court of Justice for settlement. But failure to reach agreement on reference to the International Court shall not absolve parties to the dispute from the responsibility of continuing to seek to resolve it by any of the various peaceful means referred to in paragraph 1 of this article. Article 12. Modification and duration. 1. Subpart 1. The present treaty may be modified or amended at any time by unanimous agreement of the contracting parties whose representatives are entitled to participate in the meetings provided for under Article 9. Any such modification or amendment shall enter into force when the depository government has received notice from all such contracting parties that they have ratified it. 2. Such modification or amendment shall thereafter enter into force as to any other contracting parties when notice of ratification by it has been received by the depository government. Any such contracting party from which no notice of ratification is received within a period of 2 years from the date of entry into force of the modification or amendment in accordance with the provision of subparagraph 1a of this article shall be deemed to have withdrawn from the present treaty on the date of the expiration of such period. Part 2, Subpart 1. If after the expiration of 30 years from the date of entry into force of the present treaty, any of the contracting parties whose representatives are entitled to participate in the meetings provided for under Article 9 so requests by a communication addressed to the depository government, a conference of all the contracting parties shall be held as soon as practicable to review the operation of the treaty. 2. Any modification or amendment to the present treaty, which is approved at such a conference by a majority of the contracting parties that are represented, including a majority of those whose representatives are entitled to participate in the meetings provided for under Article 9, shall be communicated by the depository government to all contracting parties immediately after the termination of the conference and shall enter into force in accordance with the provisions of paragraph 1 of the present article. 3. If any such modification or amendment has not entered into force in accordance with the provisions of subparagraph 1a of this article, within a period of 2 years after the date of its communication to all the contracting parties, any contracting party may at any time after the expiration of that period give notice to the depository government of its withdrawal from the present treaty, and such withdrawal shall take effect 2 years after the receipt of the notice by the depository government. Article 13. Ratification and entry into force. 1. The present treaty shall be subject to ratification by the signatory states. It shall be open for accession by any state which is a member of the United Nations, or by any other state which may be invited to accede to the treaty with the consent of all the contracting parties whose representatives are entitled to participate in the meetings provided for under Article 9 of the treaty. 2. Ratification of or accession to the present treaty shall be effected by each state in accordance with its constitutional processes. 3. Instruments of ratification and instruments of accession shall be deposited with the government of the United States of America, hereby designated as a depositary government. 4. The depositary government shall inform all signatory and acceding states of the date of each deposit of an instrument of ratification or accession and the date of entry into force of the treaty and of any modification or amendment thereto. 5. Upon the deposit of instruments of ratification by all the signatory states, the present treaty shall enter into force for those states and for states which have deposited instruments of accession. Thereafter, the treaty shall enter into force for any acceding state upon the deposit of its instruments of accession. 6. The present treaty shall be registered by the depositary government pursuant to Article 102 of the Charter of the United Nations. Article 14. Deposition. The present treaty, done in English, French, Russian, and Spanish languages, each version being equally authentic, shall be deposited in the archives of the Government of the United States of America, which shall transmit duly certified copies thereof to the governments of the signatory and acceding states. And that concludes my reading of the Antarctic Treaty. If any of you dumbass flirfs heard me mention anything at all about any restrictions or military actions in place to prevent you from going, you are a lying sack of shit. There is also another document I have found while researching this topic, and that is the Manual of Regulations and Guidelines relevant to the tourism and non-governmental activities in the Antarctic Treaty Area. I'll provide a link to that in the description below. The main ATCM regulations and guidelines for tourists and expedition organizers are compiled in the Manual of Regulations and Guidelines relevant to tourism and non-governmental activities in the Antarctic Treaty Area, adopted through Decision 6 in 2021. This compilation also includes the provisions applicable to tourism arising from the Antarctic Treaty and the Protocol on Environmental Protection. Aside from the established guidelines for tourist expeditions, the ATCM also provides for tourist expeditions to submit reports on their visits, Measure 4 of 2004, which sets out the requirements on contingency planning, insurance, and other matters as currently being approved by the consultative parties. The ATCM also issues specific guidelines for the sites most visited by tourists. They include practical guidance for tour operators and guides on how they should conduct visits in those sites, considering their environmental values. Most tourist operators active in the Antarctic belong to the International Association of Antarctica Tour Operators, the IAATO, which also participates in the ATCM as an invited expert organization. In 2021, through Resolution 3, the ATCM updated the general guidelines for visitors to the Antarctic, which provide general advice for visiting any location, with the objective of ensuring visits do not have adverse impacts on the Antarctic environment or on its scientific and aesthetic values. Parties implement the Antarctic Treaty and its Environment Protocol into domestic law. national legislations establish a permitting regime for activities in the Antarctica, and eligible visitors are required to obtain the necessary permits in advance from the relevant competent authority of each Antarctic Treaty Party. And there you have it, everyone. Antarctica is not some strange place where the governments of the world are going to shoot you if you try to visit. It is free and open for anyone to go, and if you ever have a chance, you should. It's an amazing place, and I hope one day I have the opportunity to see it for myself. And with that, I'll leave you with a brief photographic tour of Antarctica for your enjoyment.